Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the UH Energy Electric Vehicle webinar series, where we will be discussing fleet electrification in Texas with Chris George and Yann Culp. They'll be talking about how Houston is accelerating fleet EV adoption. My name is Mohammed Saad Maiman. I am a student at Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. Before we begin the webinar, I would like to take a minute to thank our partner, Evolve Houston. We are so glad that they have been working with us and to provide the Houstonians with reliable alternatives for transportation to accelerate clean electrification. To learn more about the events and other UH Energy webinar series, I would like to send you guys a link in the chat that you guys can look up, where we have all the previous webinar series from there, and you guys can check those out. Moving forward, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so please hold your questions until the end. And we will be utilizing the chat function. You can see in your on the right side. You guys can go ahead and submit your questions at the end of the presentation, and I will moderate the incoming questions in order that we receive. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers, starting with Chris George, who is the Executive Director at Evolve Houston. He leads efforts across fundraising, stakeholder and member engagement, and organizational development, with experiences developing and closing complex strategic partnerships in mobility space. And then joining him we have Yann Culp, who is the head of business development at EIQ Mobility. He leads all customer engagement for EIQ Mobility. I recently acquired Next Air Energy's research company. He is the former head of America e-mobility strategy for Schneider Electric and the key architect of global strategy. So without further ado, I would like to start the presentation. Chris and Yann, you guys can take over.
Great. All right. Thank you, Saad. And as Saad said, if and as you have questions throughout the presentation, you can post them in the chat, and we will tag them as questions and address them at the end of the presentation. We're also going to be conducting a couple of live polls, which will show up, I believe it'll show up on your screen. So please participate in those. They're really helpful for us, and it's a great way to help cater the flow of our presentation. It helps us engage with you much more. So without further ado, let's go. So starting off, I'll go here to the next one. You've met me and Yann. We have been working together on this effort in Houston for probably about 6 to 8 months now. And we've done quite a bit of good work, and we have a lot more to come. So we'll be sharing a little more about what we've done. We'll introduce both Evolve Houston and EIQ Mobility. We're going to talk about specifically, which is why I think a lot of folks are here, the City of Houston fleet case study, where we went in and studied the City of Houston's light-duty vehicles. We're going to look at electrification and the implications for fleets across the U.S. As you can imagine, there's a lot happening in this space. It's moving very rapidly, and both Evolve and EIQ are at the forefront of this, and so we have a lot to share. And then, for those who own, operate, manage, facilitate, finance, whatever it is, touch fleets, we're here to share some key learnings that we've found, through studying a tremendous amount of vehicles regionally, and then also nationally through the EIQ, platform. And lastly, we'll go through Q&A. Hopefully we'll leave a considerable amount of time so that we can engage with y'all, and look forward to hearing your thoughts on our presentation. So let's go forward. The Evolve Houston is the public-private partnership here in the city of Houston that is looking to address electrification and improve the region's air quality. We've got some amazing founding members, City of Houston, CenterPoint Energy, Shell, NRG, and of course U of H, who puts on these wonderful webinar series. And then we have a program management partner, LDR. Background on our efforts as an organization specifically related to fleet. We are now approaching and will have exceeded 10,000 vehicles studied in the region. And what that means is that we've looked at vehicles across various partners. We have some private partners that we've worked with that have led to actually conversion commitments, which we will be able to talk about here soon in the future. We've got partners we're kicking off studies with who are also private, but we also have been working with public entities. In addition to the city of Houston, we are working closely with with Harris County, who just recently announced that they have new, incredible, and exciting sustainability efforts. And then we're also working with Fort Bend County. And so we'll be similar to the case study and the results that you'll see today. You'll be able to hopefully see the results of those studies, which are thousands of vehicles in the near future. Yann?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So everybody knows the city of Houston, but EIQ Mobility might be less known. So a brief intro, right? We're the leading provider of fleet electrification assessments in North America. So what that means is that we absorb operational data from fleets like fuel card data or their asset data, and we transform that into very powerful insights on electrification feasibility, right? What are the right vehicles, the right chargers? What is the electric consumption profile? What is the total cost of ownership, current and future emissions, and all these key elements of decision around technical, economic, and sustainability feasibility for fleet. So you see 100,000 vehicles done to date. It's actually going close to 150,000 right now. It's growing extremely fast, hundreds of millions of data points, and clients across the US, across auto manufacturers, utilities, and large Fortune 500 fleets. And we're very excited about our work with Evolve Houston.
Great. So before we kick off with the case study, we're going to start out with the poll question. This is going to give us a sense for, I believe, who all is on this presentation. So Kyle, if you want to drop that poll. Okay, so I'll read it out. You can all see it in the chat on the right. It says, are you investigating EVs for your fleet? We should be able to see the responses as they come in live. Already have EVs, investigation and process, starting to learn, maybe someday, and heck never. I hope there's no heck nevers, but you never know. So we're actually getting a pretty good distribution here, and we're seeing, okay, starting to learn is definitely leading the way, and then maybe someday an investigation and process are neck and neck. Very good. We'll give everybody maybe 10 more seconds to answer. If you haven't answered, if you just joined, we are conducting a live poll. Great. Okay. Well,
we've got about half the audience. That's good.
Yeah, and this makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine, Yann, you've probably seen some, as you talk to fleets and as we talk to fleets as a nonprofit in the region, I think this is probably pretty consistent with.
Yeah, I mean, it's not 8% of respondees already have an EVs, and the other ones are investigating or beginning to learn. Nobody has said heck never. But 8, 10, 12% of fleets that actually have tested an EV is not unreasonable, right? And I'm guessing that the folks that are on this are probably really leaning into this, so maybe a bit more forward thinking than others.
Sure. Great. Thank you all for participating. We've got 3 more coming up throughout the presentation, so we look forward to your responses there. So let's get into the case study for the city of Houston. I think this is a really exciting and very communicative, next couple of slides. It's going to tell you some very simple things. So, key items to be aware of are, how many vehicles did we study and what percentage of those vehicles are technically feasible and economically feasible. As we get into those results, Yann can give some more context on how they provided scrutiny around that and and you'll see in the coming slides.
Sure.
So what did we study? We studied 5,300 light-duty vehicles. And I just want to put this into perspective. The reason why we're doing this is because the city of Houston is committed to 100% electrification of their light-duty non-emergency fleet. And it's a tremendous amount of vehicles. We actually did include some of their emergency fleet in this response segment. But to give you an idea of the scale of the amount of vehicles in the city, it's a lot. And so in order to coordinate electrification over the next 10 years, you're going to have some pretty key insights. So what did we get? We saw 5,300 vehicles across all of these departments, which are listed on the right side of the graph. We got some unique insights in that, 12 hours was the average operating total daily hours. That's not how long they were driving, but how long they were technically in operation. So that could mean idling, that could mean, parked somewhere. Daily mileage range, and Yann can talk to this probably more, succinctly, but there's a wide range, and that's because duty cycles of these vehicles range from, working in the Heights here, just outside the city, just north of downtown, to going all the way out to west to Katy, north to, the Woodlands, et cetera. I mean, you pick a direction, people could drive quite a bit during their duty cycles. And we said 11 main depots, and we'll show on the next screen why we said 11. There are many more depots, but these are the depots that we've identified as the most have the most potential to electrify vehicles. Yann, anything you want to add to this? Or okay, great.
Good.
So as I said, when you look at the mileage range and potential for vehicles to drive considerable amounts of miles, you'll see that there is a wide distribution of department facilities and fleet vehicles and depots. So this graph indicates and just shows the geographic breadth that Houston covers and the city has to consider when electrifying their vehicles. The dots represent, they're color coded matched to the key on the right, but the size of the dots represents how big those depots are, meaning how many vehicles are housed in the depots, as I understand it. Yann, is there anything else you want to add to this slide? I just thought it paints.
Yeah, no, I think it's important to recognize that with very large sophisticated fleets like the city of Houston, you have to do a comprehensive assessment, but at some point in time when it comes to implementation, you have to go and focus on the low-hanging fruit or the largest facilities. And so it's important to be very wide, but also focus on what can be done soon, right? And so that identification of those main facilities is important.
Absolutely. And so this is even a further distillation of the most prominent opportunities to electrify of those 11 depots. And as you can see, and we'll touch on in this next slide, there are, roughly 681 feasible options in the top 5 locations. So that's a considerable amount. That's if today we chose to electrify at those locations, we think that there's a one-to-one match for 681 of those vehicles. Now just to caveat this, we did conclude the study about a month ago. And since then, the F-150 Light or the Ford Lightning has come out. All of the manufacturers are making very large commitments to electrification and continue to. And so we would anticipate that, if we are, and we most likely will run this study again in a year or so, we're going to see a dramatic increase in feasibility.
Yeah, I mean, and look, very, as Chris knows, just in the numbers we see here, in the current state, having roughly 25% of the fleet in those 5 locations electrifiable is already a huge result.
Absolutely, and so what we'll go through on this slide is kind of what we mean by feasible. So there are a couple of definitions of feasibility that Yann can touch on, but essentially we looked at 2 types. We looked at economic feasibility, so does it make financial sense to replace your vehicle? And then technical feasibility. Is there just a vehicle that meets the bare minimum duty cycle requirements of existing fleet vehicles? Yann, do you?
Yeah, I mean, technical feasibility is super important because there's no amount of economic value that works if a fleet leadership team fails in their ability to deliver vehicles for mission critical functions, right? The city has police department, fire, waste management, and others. Those vehicles have a job to do. So you really need to make sure that the battery has the performance for the full range of duty cycles, that the battery will survive over 7 years as it slowly degrades. Houston doesn't have extreme cold weather, although you've experienced it. But you can imagine that if you live half the year in Minnesota, batteries won't operate the same way. So it's really important to nail that technical feasibility down hard, because these vehicles have a job to do.
Absolutely, and I think that it may not come to that much of a shock to us who are in the industry. But the technical feasibility of the city's fleet is quite high. And again, I'll caveat by saying this was before the Lightning announcement. This is before a number of other light duty vehicle announcements that have been made, since the completion of this study. So we're talking about, of the 5,000 plus vehicles that we studied, over 4,000 are technically feasible. So that means that the duty cycle of those vehicles can be met today with a fully electric version. And I think that it's very important to understand that. From an economic feasibility perspective, 25% of the total fleet is economically feasible. Now, again, with some of the recent announcements, with the much more affordable light duty trucks that are coming on market, and the large amount of representation they have within the fleet, the city of Houston, we can imagine that this number will grow pretty considerably the next time we run this study. And just to, again, if you haven't seen our presentation on light duty trucks, passenger trucks, and the vehicle miles traveled implications in the state of Texas, they make up 50% of our vehicle miles traveled. They're very important. And the representation within these fleets, we're seeing that there's a lot of similarities. So they're a very important segment. And then, what everybody wants to know is, okay, does this work out on paper? Is it going to save us money in the long term? And through electrifying these economically feasible vehicles, you'll get a lifetime savings of $6.9 million. And that's calculated through a total cost of ownership, I would say, algorithm that EIQ is very savvy on. Yann, you want to speak a little bit to TCO and how y'all come about?
Thanks, Chris. It is important, right? Because a lot of economic calculators are focused on just the fuel saving, right? So gasoline to electric, for example, or maybe incentives or maintenance cost. But you have to look at the full stack, right? Infrastructure, vehicle purchase price, maintenance, fuel, incentives, and residual values, right? At the end of their life, a vehicle is sold on the auction market to, Mannheim or something, right? And you need to factor that into the calculation. So the full stack of TCO is really important. And if you own that vehicle for 5 years or 10 years, the numbers are going to be different. Or if you're in Indiana or Texas or California, the numbers are going to be different. So every fleet and every use case is going to have its own TCO calculated specifically for that location, that use case. It's really important. I mean, fleets have operational requirements, but they also have budgetary requirements, and the city operates on taxpayer dollars, and you don't want to mess around with that hard-earned tax base of the citizens and the community, right?
100%. And as the public-private partnership for the city, we really aim to achieve emissions reduction through our efforts. I mean, that is our mission as a nonprofit, and that is what we strive to do, and that's what we believe will happen through electrification of fleets and other vehicles. And by electrifying the technically feasible vehicles alone, we would see over 13,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions reduced annually, which is incredible. When you start talking about 10-year ownership plus, you're just seeing incredible health benefits that I think the city employees, fleet managers, drivers, and then the general population stand to gain from. So
and Chris, look at the 62, and the 62% is also important, right? There's a lot of concern about saying, well, we're replacing, diesel or gasoline emissions by maybe coal emissions or natural gas or other grid emissions. And grids do have an emission profile, but one, the US grid is decarbonizing really fast. But even in the current state, right, in the current environment, 62% carbon reduction, it's a massive carbon reduction potential.
Totally agree. Right. Poll question number 2. Again, if you want to participate, we'd highly recommend it. It will pop up on the top right side under polls. Here we go. What percentage of the city of Houston vehicles can convert to EV at a lower cost? So this is, are you paying attention to what we're saying? Question. So again, we're talking in this question about economic feasibility, not technical feasibility.
I suspect that at some point in time, probably in the next 5 years, both numbers are going to be pretty much identical.
Yes.
But we're not exactly there yet.
Right. And I'm not sure if you can change your answer, but one is right and one is wrong. Let's see. So, Yann, you want to do the honors here?
Yeah. So 67% of you nailed it at 24%, right? 25% is the same thing. So a quarter of their fleet can be, of course, technically converted and also economically, right? So that's the number. I think the 73 relates to technical feasibility, which is a huge number in itself, but some of those vehicles would just be still more expensive.
Absolutely. 35 response. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
All right. Yann, maybe you can talk a little bit about the recommended EVs that we found in this.
Right. So I mean, each fleet operates across the country, whether you're a public or a corporate fleet, has different brand and authorization, right? If you're a public fleet, you may have to buy an American-made vehicle and such, right? But when we did this, it was, as Chris mentioned before, the F-150 Lightning came out and was announced. So again, next time we do this, then these results will be different. But based on the vehicles, we identified 4 major categories. One, the sedan with the Chevy Bolt EUV, the pickup, which is a huge vehicle category for fleets with the Tesla Cybertruck, the van or the box or enclosed vehicle, a lot for service techs. Or shuttling functions, and the Ford e-Transit, comes in with roughly 150-mile range, and then the Hyundai Kona for that sort of crossover SUV, people moving vehicle. And this is one of the interesting things, is that this market changes so fast, right? As Chris mentioned, just a few days ago, for those of you who heard, Stellantis, which is the owner of Dodge and Ram, announced $35 billion investment in EV globally, including for their Dodge and Ram and the Ram 1500, right? So I think that's coming out in 2024. So it's not tomorrow, but it's coming soon. So fundamentally, the 3 major pickup manufacturers in the US, Ford, GM, and Ram, all have very strong, very well-funded commitments to EV, which is going to be huge for fleets.
Great. So these are some of the assumptions that the city made when conducting these economic and feasibility studies. So the results are based off some of these, very bare assumptions. Yann, I might let you just walk through it again. You're probably familiar with it.
So the assumption is that we're going to have 1 charger per vehicle, so that every city employee knows where to park and how to plug in that vehicle when they finish their workday. Only level 2, which means we don't need DC fast chargers, which very often is completely sufficient for fleets, because fleets are operating in 1 or 2 shifts. And when a driver returns to a facility at the end of the day, that vehicle is going to have, 8, 10, 12 hours to charge, right? So level 2 works fine. The TCOs the total cost of ownership has to be equivalent or cheaper than gasoline TCO, which is normal. The city operates on public money, and budget control is really important. We assumed an 8-year vehicle ownership by the city. This can change, right? But in this case, this is what was requested. 100% of all routes must be insured by an EV, which means that every single vehicle here can do its daily duty with one overnight charge at a city facility, which means there is no need for public charging. Now, and some clients ask this, say, look, we're willing to tolerate, a couple of public charging events per month because there's always this one case where you have to drive 300 miles or something, stuff happens, right? Then, of course, the percentage of technical vehicles can increase. But already just with that pretty severe constraint, you saw the numbers, right? It's highly feasible. And then, of course, we factored in existing city operational work hours, right? So fundamentally saying we're not going to ask city employees to change the way they work or to change the way they deliver public services just so that they can ride an EV, right? The EV has to comply with the way the city operates right now. And then we excluded all incentives and grants, right? So this doesn't mean that the city would not avail itself of those that are from, federal or center point or whichever incentives might be available. It's just that for the purpose of this calculation, so effectively this is the worst case scenario, we did not include that. So there's really an upside to the economics, but we're just playing it really safe.
Exactly. And I think that this 8-year vehicle ownership by the city is also important. A lot of the manufacturers are coming out with battery warranties that are up to 8 years. And so this, if we're looking ahead, is a really good indicator of where the market's going. But it also, again, as Yann said, this is worst case scenario, in the event batteries last longer, in the event the vehicles last longer, you're going to see, again, a tremendous reduction in the, improvement in the economic feasibility across the board. And the grants and incentives, I want to highlight that as well. These are hypercritical, and there's a lot of unknowns still at the federal level. And so I think it was smart by the city to choose to not include those as, funding that will be available. It's unsure, and we're uncertain at this point. We think there may be some momentum around that, but they did a great job of eliminating those for the time being. And then what's next for the city? Without speaking too much on behalf of the city, we'll kind of give the high level overview. Personally, and from Evolve Houston's perspective, Mayor Turner and Director Glasscock over the fleet management are doing an incredible job to put a program in place to help meet the 100% goal of electrifying light duty non-emergency vehicles. So what does that really look like at a high level? And we'll be working with the city to communicate this more broadly moving forward in more specific terms. But at a high level, we'll be looking at those locations that were identified in the fleet study as priorities. So to say, how do we electrify those first, because those make the most sense economically. We're innovating around the EV procurement model, and that is under the leadership of Director Glasscock, who is doing a wonderful job on that front. Educating department leads and fleet managers on what it means to electrify. This is hugely critical, as I'm sure Yann will touch on here coming up. Fleet managers, need a new education. Fleet drivers need to sit in a car and feel what it's like to drive an EV, understand charging profiles, et cetera. And so there's a huge amount of education that goes around this, and Evolve is supporting the city and these other fleets in that endeavor. And then I think this last piece, which I personally like, is we're communicating this to the public. I think it's important to know that, as Yann's mentioned a couple times, tax dollars are being spent well, and we're getting the added benefit in this case of improving the public's health. And I think that not enough can be said for that. Houston is in dire need to improve its air quality, and we're doing some tremendous things to achieve that. Poll question number 3. Okay, if you have a fleet, does your fleet have an electrification goal? If so, what is it? So this will give us, a very good indication of who is on the call, and then also or on the video, and then what people are and organizations are looking to achieve. So again, if you want to participate, which we highly would recommend, go to the polls section at the top right, click it, and then participate. I believe that's how it works. So already we're seeing, a considerable amount of you do not own fleets, and that's perfectly fine. Would love to know if your organization where you work does have a fleet and plans to electrify. I think that's...
Well, wouldn't no mean they don't have a goal?
Yeah, it could be. You're right.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe you don't have one, or you don't have a fleet. But still exciting. We've got a 75% or more. It looks like at least 4, and
that's ambitious.
These are great. Yeah, very good.
And but it is interesting, right? Because I think, and we'll talk about this later, but looking at the Houston case study and what we see across all our customers across the country, having an electrification goal is not some crazy harebrained goal, right? It's becoming clearly extremely feasible. And I'm not saying feasible for 100% of the fleet, right? I mean, it might be 10, might be 20, might be 30, might be half or more. But having electrification ambitions is becoming much more real and feasible for pretty much any fleet than what it was even 3 years ago.
Agree. So outcome of this is that you either don't have a fleet electrification goal, or you don't have a fleet. That's the majority of the folks on here, and that is totally understandable. But great to see we've got at least 5 on the call who have a 75% or greater goal. That's wildly ambitious and exciting.
Yeah.
Maybe not so wildly ambitious. Yeah.
No, I honestly, it depends on the time frame, right? If the goal is to electrify 55% of your vehicles next year, that's ambitious. But if it's over the next decade, it's quite quite reasonable. For those of you who get our newsletter, you can see some of the data. Ernst & Young, big consulting firm, assessed that half of sales will be EV by 2030, right, in the US, and this could. Internal combustion vehicles might represent less than 1% of sales by 2040. So just insanely impressive numbers.
I'll hand it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So, going from what's happening and what the city and Evolve have done here locally, it's kind of interesting to figure out what are the implications at a national level, right? So, what's driving this, right? So one, of course, is policy and sustainability, right? Cities and states across the nation are growing their policy and legislation that is supportive of electric vehicles. And honestly, I find what's interesting is that it's becoming more and more bipartisan, right? Blue and red states are equally interested and growing this policy, right? So Virginia and Colorado, and of course California and Massachusetts, but Oregon and Idaho and others are starting to grow some of that. But also on the corporate side, right, or on the city and corporate side. So EV 100 is a big, or the Ceres corporate EV Alliance is a big trade association for EV members or companies that are committed to EV, and that number is growing dramatically. And of course, the climate mayors, of which Mayor Turner of Houston is the chair for the EV working group, is very, very strong in this space. And then the corporations, you can see these are not insignificant corporations, right? Of course, Amazon has made a commitment to electrify 100,000 of its delivery vans with Rivian. And then you can see that's a FedEx delivery van with a vehicle made by General Motors called a Bright Drop electric vehicle. And First Student, who is a joint venture of ours, has 55,000 school buses across the U.S., and they're committed to electrifying those vehicles in the next 10 years. So there's this sort of conjunction that's really robust. But I think it's also there's something missing here. Maybe okay. Anyway, in case it doesn't show up, I do want to point out that the OEMs are investing like crazy in this, right? So if you think about all the manufacturers of trucks and pickups and vehicles that operate in the US, in aggregate, they've committed to $250 billion just for EVs, just for the US. So I mentioned Dodge and Ram being the latest just a few days ago, 35 billion. But Ford is the same number, General Motors is the same number, all of the manufacturers are pouring in. And when you look at the economic opportunities across the US, this is our own data. So last year we aggregated all of our customer data and ran a national assessment. And you can see that 57% of light-duty vehicles are economically feasible. So I don't want to say this is representative of all your use cases. This is only the data we collected from our own customers. So 22,000 vehicles at the time. But you can see that the color coding is kind of interesting, right? Everybody thinks it's only for California. And granted, there is a ton of opportunity there on the West Coast. But look at Texas, look at Louisiana, look at Florida, look at Georgia, look at Wisconsin, right? Michigan. There is a lot of economic opportunity, in part because these are low-cost electricity states, right? In some cases, they have really good climate for EV, or they have growing incentives. So the economics can be really better in across the US than I think a lot of people assume. So if we look at that total cost of ownership, the vehicles, out of the 22,000 vehicles we assessed, we're in the process of doing it again with 150,000 vehicles, but at the time it was 22,000. 50, across light, medium, and heavy duty, 59% are technically feasible, and 38%, so roughly a third of all vehicles we assessed can be converted to EV right now for cheaper than their gasoline or diesel vehicles. Right, that's a really big number.
But Yann, do you think that will remain consistent as you look at, you've seen a lot of the studies. Do you think that this distribution will look very similar
in the
100,000 vehicles? Yeah,
I think it's going to be better, simply because over the past year, prices of EVs have dropped. Right, there are more models. So the pickups at the time, there was maybe, I think Lordstown and Rivian had made announcements, but now we have Ford and the Cybertruck, and I'm pretty sure any day we'll hear from General Motors. So the amount of suitable vehicles has grown. So that number, I think, is in percentage is going to grow dramatically.
Good.
And then, of course, things that we don't know yet, like, are Republicans and Democrats going to be able to negotiate an infrastructure plan? And will that include some extension of federal incentives for EVs? We don't know yet. But if that were the case, then the numbers will be even better. And I think it's also important to recognize that not all categories of vehicles are moving at the same speed, right? So light duty, sedans, SUVs, quarter-ton pickups are highly electrifiable, right? Because of the use cases, availability of EVs and of models, right? And you can see 57% in aggregate across the US of those vehicles can be converted cost effectively, right? So for cheaper than their gasoline equivalents. And then medium duty is a bit more difficult. Again, this was a year ago, things will change. And then heavy duty is probably, especially long haul, right? So over the road transportation is going to be probably the most difficult, in part because of the use cases, right? If you're doing 600 miles a day, then charging needs to be public access charging, and fast charging is technically more difficult. But that's going to change, right? This is a snapshot in 2020, in 2021, and 22, and 23. These numbers are going to start accelerating, I think, pretty significantly. And then also kind of interesting is to look at the different use cases, right? So, utility or work vehicles, right? So, kind kind of the 150, 250 or cutaway format with upfitting and hydraulics, but food and bev delivery and logistics, right? So box trucks and delivery vans. You can see that the percentage of economic feasibility is pretty high across the board, which is, I find, really interesting, right? It's not only for certain like sales reps who drive in a sedan and those guys. No, this is pretty across the board. So the fourth poll, Saad, if you could put that up.
Again, the poll will pop up on the right side here shortly.
Yeah, there we go.
Here it is. You want to read it, Yann?
Yeah. So for those of you who are reading also, though, looking at the map, what are the 3 best states for cost-effective light-duty EV? Right, California, New York, Vermont, Utah, Illinois, Iowa, Texas, Florida, and Oregon, or New York, Michigan, and Hawaii.
So nobody thinks Hawaii, huh?
Yeah, actually, the Hawaii Public Utility Commission and Hawaii Electric are actually, very aggressive on electrification, in part because as you can imagine, 100% of their hydrocarbons are imported, right, and have to be shipped in, and so the logistics and the cost of gasoline and diesel is a real problem for Hawaii. So we have over 60% of the audience that has responded, and you are correct, right? Texas, Florida, and Oregon, which is 60% of you voted for those, and that's correct. And I don't want to say my point is not to say that California, New York, and Vermont are not suitable. I'm just saying that in the current state, using the data we collected, Texas, Florida, and Oregon are very good states for electrification. If some of you saw a webinar we did with the city of Portland, who is a client of ours, and then Portland General Electric last week, you can see some of the results for the city of Portland. It's very, very impressive. So let's move on. I think a couple of other small points here is really range anxiety, which is a big topic, right? Are the vehicles going to operate as I need, right? And so what we did is took a distribution of pickups, right, passenger trucks, and we looked at a distribution of all their daily driving ranges over the course of a year, right? We don't take the best day; we take an entire 12 months of operating data, and we distributed that on a curve. And you can see that like the Rivian R1T or the Cybertruck, cover the vast majority of operating routes for pickups, at least in our customer base. But you can see that even like the Ford 150 with around 300 miles would also cover, 90% of ranges. And then I think the Ram 1500, they claim they're going to be somewhere around 500 miles also. So the ranges are there, and that range anxiety, we believe, is probably more of a perception than reality. And I'm not saying that there are not some use cases where those vehicles do need to do long distances, right? That's not my point. My point is simply to say that if you look at the distribution of real life usage, there is 80 or 90% of a fleet that can really do its job within the range of EVs that are available in the market today, right? And that's a big lesson. But I think it's important to, to highlight that fleet electrification is a complex journey, right? Chris and I don't want to minimize this, right? You need to go and pick locations and choose the right vehicles and the right chargers and the vendors and define those costs and emissions and make those decisions. And then once you've done that, you have to finance and deploy these assets, right? How are you going to fund this? Are you going to go and get third-party financing? Is it going to be a bond? How are you going to do this? And then you need to deploy these assets. And it does take time, right? You have to get permitting and trench the parking lot, and you have to go do this. And then you have to operate and optimize the new electric fleet and the facilities at which they charge. And the way you charge an electric vehicle is important, right? It's not like just fueling, gasoline, at 9 o'clock in the morning or at 9 o'clock at night. Doesn't make a difference. Electricity does make a difference. And then you need to learn from that, those first pilots, to then get better and better at those deployments and then deploy at scale across the fleet. So it is a complex journey, and I think we need to recognize it. And of course, this is what EIQ Mobility does. But organizations like Evolve are there to help fleets go through this journey and identify how to go and execute. And some of that is because of the highly complex ecosystem that these fleets operate in, with tons of vendors, and whether vehicles or chargers or utilities and incentives. So it's a complex environment, and it's especially important to figure it out from an infrastructure perspective, because you don't want to go and install infrastructure for your 17 vehicles at a facility in 2022 and then discover that actually, by 2025, you have 72 vehicles, and you need to go and rip out everything you've done to expand your switchgear, negotiate with your utility, and sort of build out the local transformer substation. So it's important to figure that out, and it's incredibly important, but it's also important to recognize some of the complexities. So I think the last poll question, Asad, if you could put that up, I do want to make sure we keep time for questions. So what is the most favorable financing for procurement? Is it operating expense all the way? So try to lease as much as you can effectively. Is it capital all the way? And this is cash up front, but the economics are good over time, or it's a mix, or I don't know.
Yann, maybe I think we did have a question already that we could address during this poll, but in looking at the city's fleet and determining economic feasibility, did y'all consider the type of financing in your assumptions? And if so, what assumptions did you make around that?
Yeah. So in our work as EIQ Mobility, what we did is we assumed the cost of capital, right? And of course, that cost of capital depends on each fleet and the way they raise money themselves, right, through bonds or through other means, right? But so we integrated that cost of capital into the assessment. Now, what we did not do is determine how the city, what are the options the city might use to actually go and raise that in real life. Maybe Chris, do you have any ideas?
Not, later on.
Later on, okay, yeah. So in terms of the poll results, so we have half of the audience here, and 62% said it's kind of a mix of OPEX, and CapEx, right? And then, interesting enough, 28%, you guys are honest, said I don't know, and I think that's a good point, right? It's hard to gauge how you're going to finance something, although the economics over 5 or 8 years are going to be really good. Nonetheless, there is an upfront capital cost, right? There's a barrier to entry there. And I think it's kind of cool that you were honest about it. It's not an easy thing. There are a lot of entities who are trying to figure out how to transform fleets from a capital project to a as a service, where vehicles are being leased, but maybe the infrastructure is being leased, and that takes the financial burden off the fleet operator and into the hands of a third party, which might be a very powerful way to go. It's already an existing practice for gasoline and diesel vehicles to be leased, but extending that philosophy to electric vehicles might be really interesting.
Yeah, and you're seeing a lot of momentum around the financial sector, from the Green Bank in Connecticut offering, EV specific, services, to, some of the larger banks around the world, making very incredibly large commitments, in the order of hundreds of billions of dollars to, sustainability, which is inclusive of electrification.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll give an example again. This is one that's close to us, but our parent company, NextEra Energy, has a joint venture with First Student, which is the biggest private school bus operator in the U.S. with 50,000 vehicles, buses, right? And the joint venture is really developing a fully financed electric school bus, right? The vehicles, the school buses, and the infrastructure and energy contracts all packaged into one for their school district. So that's a really, a case in point. I do want to go really quickly over some do's and don'ts, and this is again our own opinion, right? But it's really important to do this based on data. You need to most fleets, all fleets have very robust data system, fuel, odometer, M&O, telematics, if available. And then you need to think about scenarios. There is no perfect electrification. Am I going to use one auto manufacturer versus another? It's going to be 5 years or 8 years, right? But the scenarios is a really important way to come up with one of them that actually is the best compromise between cost and feasibility and emissions and such. And then it's important to develop an execution plan based on those scenarios with a lot of stakeholder buy-in. I think there's a tendency to pilot by saying, hey, let's go and order 3 EV sedans and let's see what happens. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's difficult to scale from that. And it's probably better to actually do the homework like the city has done, and then use those assessments then to create a plan. And then the other part is start now, start yesterday, because even if it's a small pilot, even if it's 5 or 10 or 20 EVs, this market is going so fast that if you wait till things get better, you're going to be lost. And your auto partners and your leasing partners and your local engineering firms that can help you, or your local utilities, will be up to their eyeballs with other fleets, and they won't have time anymore, right? So starting quick is important, right? On the don'ts, again, personal opinion, don't try to get quotes from 30 to 50 different vendors, because you won't know how much you want to do. And so you're asking them, it's like going to a wedding and asking the caterer for a quote for for dinner, but you don't tell them how many guests are going to show up and what their what their dietary restrictions may be. That's going to be tough for the caterer to give you a quote. You don't need to obsess about perfect telematics data. A lot of fleets don't have that. That's okay. Fuel data, in our experience, works just fine. Again, don't focus on procurement without engaging the stakeholders, right? Facility, fleet, procurement, finance, and sustainability in the organization. Don't pilot with just a few EVs without a data plan, right? You need to understand how you're going to record the data from those pilots so that you learn and do better in the next wave. And then again, don't wait till it gets better, because it'll always be better some days, like an iPhone. If you wait for the next iPhone that's better, well, you can wait your entire life. So, we all have a cell phone, and we know that in 3 years we'll get a new one, and EVs will get better. The next wave of EVs you deploy will be even better, but start. So that being said, Q&A, Chris, right?
Yeah, and I think, Yann, we can go over to the question section up here, and I might just tick through a couple of these. So if you would like to ask us a question, simply in the chat, post a question, we can tag it, and then we'll answer it live. So the question will come up on your screen, and then we'll be able to talk to it. So I'm gonna maybe pull up one as how Evolve sees just electrification in general for the region as a startup, as one to kick off, and then Yann, I'll let you pick one after that if that works.
Yep, go for it.
Okay, so this one says, apart from charging infrastructure and financing, what do you think are the biggest challenges for at-scale adoption? And then how can the city of Houston ensure that the transition to EVs is equitable? So I think this is a wonderful, wonderful question. Obviously, it has some crossover with the fleet discussion that we just had. But more importantly, this is addressing Houston on a regional level. And how we do that at Evolve Houston is we address affordability, availability, and awareness. And really, the availability piece is being taken care of by the manufacturers, so we can influence that only so much. The affordability piece, we can do as much as we can to advocate for things that are good for our environment, for the air quality in the region, and then for incentives that are favorable to those outcomes. And then lastly, the awareness piece. This is something that I touched on in the results and what the city is doing internally with their fleets, but I think externally awareness is just critical. We have we found that getting people to touch, feel, drives EVs really does a wonderful job of painting a picture of what the benefits are, not only for the environment, but for your driving experience. They're faster, quieter. Tesla has I believe the highest safety rating of any vehicle ever. there's a ton of benefits. So how do we think about this? Awareness, and how does this fit into an equitable transition to EVs? This means that not only the folks who are going to be the early adopters of EVs get to see and test drive vehicles, but everybody. As a public-private partnership, we are really looking to serve the entirety of the Houston region. And so a lot of our efforts as an organization will be focused on traditionally disadvantaged communities, through various marketing and awareness type campaigns. And there are other levers as well, from potentially, advantageous financing that may be coming out down the pike, and grants and incentives that we will look to leverage. Yann?
Yep. So I'm going to take here one on economic feasibility. What are the main factors for economic feasibility, right? So first of all, if you look at that full stack, vehicle upfront price, for sure, right? What is the purchase price of that vehicle? Then we factor in the M&O, right? The maintenance savings of the internal combustion vehicle versus electric vehicle. And we have research across multiple sources that indicate the expected maintenance savings, right? Then of course fuel. So we're moving from diesel or gasoline, and we actually take real pricing from the fleet, right? So actual fuel data and fuel pricing data. And then we look at the local cost of electricity. So of course, electricity in California and electricity in Houston are not priced the same, right? So we look at that. Then we look at the infrastructure. So what is the cost of all the chargers that are required for that particular fleet, and the labor cost to install that. We then also look at all the incentives, so whether they're federal, state, or grants, and we track those. And of course, incentives for a school bus in Missouri is going to be really different than for sedans in Michigan, right? So each of those is going to have their own. And then we look at residual value. So somebody else talked about that. So what we do is we have data from hundreds of thousands of vehicles on internal combustion and electric residual values. And for vehicles who don't have a history yet, like we don't know what the residual value of a GMC Hummer is going to be in 7 years because it's not even out yet. We've created models based on existing EVs to model what future EVs might look like. So granted, there's a degree of uncertainty, like it's like forecasting the stock exchange, right? You don't really know, but you can look at historic data and create models that enable you to have a TCO, which is pretty darn accurate. You want to take the next one, Chris?
Unfortunately, I think we're coming close to time. So what we can do is take down those questions, and we can reach out to the people and personally answer those questions. We can also put them on our website when we put up this recorded webinar. What I would like to do before we leave, thank you guys so much for taking your time out, Chris and Yann, and talking to us about fleet electrification in Houston. And further, I would like to thank our sponsor, Evolve Houston. Without them, they're providing everything they're doing to provide the Houstonians with grants and raising awareness all about electrification. Also, I would like to thank you all for joining. Without you guys, the attendees, these wouldn't be possible. With that saying, please join us next month. We're going to have Professor David Rapson from UC Davis on August 25th around 12:30. He will be talking about the electricity used with electric vehicle and the mass adoption of EVs. So thank you all so much for joining, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone. And next month's presentation will answer many of the questions that are in our chat, actually. So please tune in. UC Davis is doing wonderful work.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.